For decades, Brian May has been known not just as the legendary guitarist of Queen, but as one of the kindest, most thoughtful figures in the rock world, a man with a heart as big as his hair. Fans adore him for his humility, his compassion for animals, and his deep love for Freddie Mercury and the band that changed music forever. But behind the stage lights and charming smiles, there was once a storm that few ever knew existed. It happened during a time when Queen was at the height of fame, when Brian was working closely with another artist on a major collaboration that had the entire industry talking. On the surface, everything looked perfect. Two icons, two massive egos, one explosive partnership. But behind the scenes, tensions quietly boiled until they could no longer be ignored. Those close to the guitarist recall the uneasy chemistry, the creative clashes, and the growing resentment that eventually turned into something much darker. "Brian doesn't hate easily," said one insider. But this one person really got to him. It changed the way he saw collaboration forever. The story has never been publicly discussed in full, not until now. Over the years, bits and pieces have surfaced in interviews, cryptic quotes, and awkward moments caught on camera. But recently, in a rare conversation reflecting on his long career, Brian May finally hinted at what really happened, and who that one co-star truly was. The truth, when you hear it, might shock even Queen's most loyal fans. Because this wasn't a casual disagreement. It was a clash of pride, artistry, and betrayal that left scars still visible today. It all began in the late 1980s, a time when Queen's fame was unshakable, and Brian May was admired as one of rock's most innovative guitarists. But beneath the glamour and the anthems, he was a perfectionist, meticulous, emotional, and deeply committed to the art of making music that meant something. So when the opportunity arose to collaborate with another major artist, one who was equally passionate, outspoken, and stubborn, it seemed like destiny. The artist in question was none other than a superstar whose name carried just as much weight as Queen's. Their collaboration was supposed to bridge genres, blending May's soulful guitar with the other star's powerful, unconventional voice. On paper, it was a dream come true. In reality, it would soon become a creative nightmare. Brian went into it with high hopes, recalled a studio engineer who witnessed the sessions. He respected this person's talent deeply. But from day one, it was clear they both wanted to be in control, and neither one was willing to back down. The recording sessions were tense from the start. Brian's methodical approach, carefully layering guitar harmonies, adjusting every tone, clashed hard with the other artist's impulsive style. "They were total opposites," said another crew member. Brian wanted structure. The other one wanted chaos. That's where it started to fall apart. At first, they tried to keep things professional. Brian's quiet, diplomatic nature often calmed heated discussions. But as the project dragged on, the disagreements grew personal. "Brian doesn't shout," one insider said, but you could see the frustration building in him. He'd clench his jaw, stare at the floor, and just go silent. The breaking point came during a late-night session when tempers flared over a guitar solo that Brian had spent hours perfecting. The other star dismissed it as too clean, insisting on a more wild take. Brian, hurt and insulted, refused to change it. What followed was a shouting match that shocked everyone in the room. "It was like two worlds colliding," said a witness. Brian, the gentleman scientist of rock, versus this unpredictable storm of ego and emotion. After that night, things were never the same. The collaboration, once hailed as a revolutionary pairing, began to crumble. The media, unaware of the full story, continued to praise them. But behind the scenes, they could barely stand to be in the same room. In interviews years later, Brian would carefully avoid mentioning the project, or he'd smile politely and change the subject. But fans noticed the subtle tension whenever that artist's name came up. "You could tell there was history there," said one journalist who interviewed him. He never said anything cruel, but his silence said enough. For Brian May, the experience was more than just a failed collaboration. It became a lesson in trust, pride, and the cost of artistic passion. It reminded him that not all creative partnerships are built to last, and that sometimes the people we admire most can disappoint us in ways we never expect. Still, the world never forgot that fateful partnership. Even decades later, whispers continue among music insiders about what really went wrong and why Brian never forgave that co-star. But to understand the full picture, we have to go deeper into the moments of betrayal that followed, the public smiles that hid private tension, and the reason Brian May quietly vowed never to work with that person again. As the days in the studio turned into weeks, what began as creative friction between Brian May and his co-star grew into something far more personal, a quiet, festering resentment that no one on the team could ignore. There was this tension you could feel in the air. One producer later recalled, Brian's patience was wearing thin, and the other artist knew exactly how to push his buttons. It wasn't just about music anymore. It was about respect. Brian had always prided himself on professionalism, on giving everyone a voice during collaborations. But his co-star seemed determined to dominate every session, dismissing ideas, overriding suggestions, and acting as if the spotlight belonged to them alone. Brian would come in with beautifully layered guitar parts, ideas for harmonies, said a sound engineer. But by the time the other artist was done, everything Brian had built would get stripped down or changed. Completely. The final straw came when the other musician made a public comment, a subtle but unmistakable jab, during an interview promoting their joint project. When asked about working with Brian, they smirked and said, "He's great at what he does, but sometimes he takes himself a little too seriously." Those who knew Brian say that line hit him like a knife. "He's sensitive," said one friend. "He doesn't show it, but he feels things deeply." That comment wasn't just rude. It belittled everything he stood for as an artist. Behind closed doors, Brian confronted his co-star, demanding an explanation. The conversation reportedly turned icy fast. Brian expected an apology, one insider revealed. Instead, he got sarcasm. The argument escalated, with both sides walking away furious. And from that point forward, their partnership was effectively over. Though the two still had contractual obligations to finish their work, the atmosphere was toxic. Brian barely spoke to them, said a crew member. He'd come in, record his parts, and leave. There was no more laughter, no connection, just tension. In the end, when the record was finally released, it did well commercially, but those who knew the backstory say the success was hollow for Brian. He hated how fake it all felt, said a close friend. Everyone called it a creative triumph, but to him, it represented betrayal and ego. When asked years later about the collaboration, Brian's response was polite but revealing. He called it a learning experience, his diplomatic way of saying it was something he'd rather forget. Sometimes, he said in one interview, two people can have enormous respect for each other's talent and still not get along as human beings. Behind the gentle smile and thoughtful tone, those words carried the weight of disappointment. For Brian, it wasn't just the arguments or creative differences that hurt. It was the realization that someone he'd once admired had chosen pride over partnership. After that project, Brian quietly distanced himself from similar high-profile collaborations. He focused more on his solo work, his love of astrophysics, and his advocacy for wildlife. Friends say the experience made him more cautious about who he trusted in the industry. He became guarded, said one. Not bitter, just careful. He learned that not everyone who calls you a friend truly means it. Still, the story didn't end there. Years later, fate would bring the two back into the same orbit once again, this time under very different circumstances. What happened next would reveal just how deep the scars went and whether forgiveness was ever truly possible between them. Years passed after the fallout between Brian May and his infamous co-star. Both artists went their separate ways, each continuing to build their legacies, though rarely acknowledging one another. For Brian, it was a painful chapter he had quietly buried. He focused instead on healing, rediscovering his love for music through solo projects and Queen's later revival with new collaborators. But as fate often does, it found a way to reopen old wounds. It was sometime in the early 2000s when Brian's path crossed once again with the very person he had sworn never to work with. A charity concert was being organized, a massive event uniting some of the biggest names in music for a global cause. When Brian saw the guest list, his heart sank. There it was, that name, the one person he had hoped never to see again. Friends say Brian considered dropping out of the lineup.
He didn't want to deal with that energy again, said one insider.
He remembered how ugly things had gotten, but in the end, he decided the cause was bigger than his feelings. At the event's rehearsal, witnesses recall the tension in the room when the two finally locked eyes. It was silent, said a sound tech. They just stared at each other for a few seconds. Everyone was holding their breath. To the surprise of many, the co-star approached Brian first, extending a hand and flashing a half smile. "No hard feelings, right?" they said casually. Brian, ever the gentleman, shook their hand, but those close to him could tell it was forced. "He's polite to a fault," said another musician. "Even when he's angry, he'll never show it in public. But that doesn't mean he forgets." During the performance that followed, both artists shared the stage briefly. And though the audience cheered, those backstage could sense the frost between them. "They didn't even look at each other," one organizer admitted. It was like two strangers pretending to be old friends. After the concert, Brian slipped out quietly. He didn't stay for the after-party or the press photos, but that brief reunion stirred up emotions he thought he'd long overcome. Later, in a rare moment of vulnerability, he spoke about the experience during an interview, without naming names. "Sometimes you realize that closure doesn't come from others," he said softly. "It comes from within you. You can forgive, but that doesn't mean you have to let them back in." Despite that, industry insiders claim the co-star continued to drop hints about their friendship with Brian in later interviews, often in a way that seemed self-serving. They loved name-dropping him, one journalist noted. But Brian never responded. He stayed silent, which said more than any statement could. In truth, Brian May didn't hate easily. His heart had always been one of compassion, toward his bandmates, his fans, and even toward animals he'd never met. But when trust was broken, it cut deep. "He's a man of principle," said a close friend. "He'll forgive mistakes, but betrayal? That's different. Still, time has a strange way of softening even the hardest edges." As Brian grew older and began reflecting on his long career, he started to see the experience not just as a wound, but as a lesson. "Every person who tests you teaches you something," he once said. Even the difficult ones. The scars from that turbulent partnership never fully disappeared. But neither did Brian's dignity. He handled it the way only he could, quietly, gracefully, and without bitterness. Yet few fans ever realized the depth of that story, or how much it shaped his later years. Because in the world of rock and roll, some feuds burn bright and fade away, but others, like this one, leave a mark that time itself struggles to erase. After decades of keeping the story behind his feud with this co-star private, Brian May finally opened up in recent interviews, carefully, thoughtfully, and without sensationalism. Fans who had only seen the polished public persona of the Queen guitarist were stunned to hear the truth. For the first time, Brian shared not just the what of the conflict, but the why, the emotions, the creative clashes, and the sense of betrayal that had haunted him for years. He began by reflecting on the early days of the collaboration, explaining how much respect he initially had for the co-star. "I admired them as an artist," Brian said. "I thought we could create something extraordinary together. But it became clear very quickly that we were approaching music and life from completely different places." Brian recounted the moments of tension in the studio, how he felt sidelined and undermined despite his contributions. "I don't mind disagreements in music, they often make the song better," he explained. But this was different. It became personal, and that's something I couldn't accept. The public comment made by his co-star, he admitted, was the moment he truly realized the depth of the rift. "It wasn't just words," he said. "It was a dismissal of everything I had put into that project. It hurt more than I can describe. And honestly, it stayed with me for years." Yet Brian's account wasn't about revenge or bitterness. He spoke about the experience as a lesson in human nature and professionalism. "I've learned that not everyone who shares your passion shares your values," he said. "Sometimes people take advantage, sometimes egos clash, and sometimes trust is broken. And that's okay. It's part of life." He also addressed the rare encounters that followed: the charity concert, The brief on-stage reunion, the awkward glances and forced pleasantries. "I've always believed in being courteous," he explained. "I can forgive, but I don't have to forget. And I certainly don't have to pretend everything is fine when it's not." For Brian, the story of this co-star is more than just a personal anecdote. It's a cautionary tale for younger musicians entering the industry. "Respect matters," he said. "Collaboration matters. And knowing who you can trust, really trust, matters more than fame or opportunity." Yet despite the lingering tension, Brian emphasized that the experience never diminished his love for music or his respect for his own bandmates. "Queen taught me the value of loyalty, of friendship, of creativity without compromise," he said. "That's why I've always tried to focus on the people who lift me up, not the ones who bring me down." In the end, Brian May's revelation about this secret animosity is as much about resilience as it is about conflict. He doesn't speak with anger or vindictiveness. He speaks with clarity, wisdom, and the perspective of someone who has seen the highs and lows of a lifetime in music. "I've made peace with it," he said, "and that's enough." For fans, the story adds a new layer of understanding to a legendary guitarist who has always seemed larger than life. Brian May is not only a virtuoso, a visionary, and a rock icon, he's also human, flawed, and profoundly principled. And for those who wonder who that co-star was, Brian leaves it at this: the lesson isn't about them. It's about staying true to yourself, your art, and the people who matter most. In revealing this secret, Brian May reminds us that even legends face betrayal, conflict, and disappointment, and that how they respond defines their legacy far more than the feud itself.